Welcome, everyone. We're going to wait until everyone joins from the waiting room and then we'll get started. So just give us one minute. Okay, Brandy, it looks like pretty much everyone is in. So I'm going to let you go ahead and start us off.
Great, thanks so much, Lauren. Thanks everybody for joining us on this webinar. Brandy Ryder here, the Executive Director of the Colorado Broadband Office. And I just want to say that we're really pleased to finally be at the point where we are launching the capital projects funds. And I know it's been a lot of anticipation, a lot of lead up to this moment. And I just want to thank my team and my staff and all the stakeholders who have given us input and have put this program together. And just it's been a journey, and it's been one that I've been very excited about. And obviously I'm just impressed with everybody on my team and as well as our stakeholders. So today we're going to go over the capital projects funds. And then obviously, according to our deadline, the applications opens up next Tuesday, June 20th. So, but I just want to say thanks again for joining this webinar. Our team will answer all your questions and go through the presentation. And we really look forward to working with you all and partnering with you guys on bridging the digital divide. This is the first step in our very long process of a lot of money and a lot of awards. So again, thank you so much, and I'll hand it over to.
Thank you very much, Brandy. I really appreciate it. Frederick Feit with Tilson. It's our pleasure to be assisting the Colorado Broadband Office on the capital projects funds. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm just going to start sharing my screen. If somebody could just make sure that the appropriate view is being displayed, I would appreciate it. Just for any technical difficulties. Is that correct?
No, we can see two screens.
So this was the Zoom meetings quirk. Is that correct now?
Yes.
Looks good.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay, so we have a lot of ground to cover, as I mentioned. I'm going to move relatively quickly through the slides. We have a fairly large number of people in attendance, so questions should be entered into the chat. Please just use the chat function of Zoom, type your questions into the chat, and we will endeavor to leave a chunk of time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. If appropriate, we'll address a few of them throughout, but do use the chat. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the slide deck will be made available in the coming days. So let's get started. And oops. Oh, don't use Zoom as much as some other platforms. Yep, so we're discussing the Advance-CPF Capital Projects Fund. The webinar will be recorded. So just a few disclaimers. The Capital Projects Fund is the Advance-CPF program is funded directly from the American Rescue Plan Act, in particular the Capital Projects Fund tranche of funding in the American Rescue Plan Act. And as such, it's, even though the program is being administered by the Colorado Broadband Office, it comes with rules as a result of the enabling federal legislation and from the U.S. Department of Treasury, which is administering the Capital Projects Fund, and the U.S. Treasury CPF guidelines. The information presented on these slides don't represent any legal advice or tax advice or anything like that. And grantees, applicants are encouraged to seek their own counsel where appropriate. And in the event of any discrepancy between CBO published material, such as the program guidelines and any supporting material, and the enabling legislation, ARPA, or the U.S. Treasury guidelines for the Capital Projects Fund, the federal and requirements will take precedent. And we strongly urge all applicants to closely review information on the U.S. Treasury's Capital Projects Fund website, in particular the program guidelines. So in terms of program purpose, just want to be clear that this is being administered as a competitive grant program. The state of Colorado's Capital Projects Fund allocation will be distributed as a competitive grant program by CBO, housed within the Office of Information Technology. The Capital Projects Fund, the Advance-CPF grant program, is a last mile program. So it's designed to fund last mile infrastructure to serve unserved and underserved locations. And we'll go through the definition of what those are. So it's a last mile project. Middle mile network segments are allowed if, but only if they are necessary to facilitate last mile service. Approximately $162 million of the ARPA Capital Projects Fund is targeted for this opportunity. And eligible applicants include private entities, municipal governments, county governments, tribal governments, cooperatives, and multi-party entities, including public-private partnerships comprised of otherwise eligible entities. All right, so there's a very specific last mile focus that's very clear in ARPA and in the Treasury Capital Projects Fund guidelines. This is a last mile grant opportunity. Eligible locations are defined in the enabling legislation as well as Treasury guidelines. They're very specific with the capital projects funds and just a little bit different than some other federal funded grant opportunities historically. So eligible locations are defined as those that are lacking access to reliable wireline service of 100 megabits downstream, 20 megabits upstream or better, and do not have an existing or enforceable state or federal funding commitment also for reliable wireline service of 120 or better. So here ARPA and the Treasury are making a very clear line of distinction between reliable wireline, which essentially is cable and fiber, and all wireless and all legacy copper technologies. Of course, when looking at location eligibility, satellite and mobile is not relevant, not taken into consideration. In the speeds category, the applications that are proposing fiber to the prem projects that are able to deliver service of symmetrical gigabit service with no caps are encouraged and in fact are scored. That's a scored criteria. The enabling legislation, ARPA, as well as the Treasury guidelines strongly emphasize that the funding should be prioritized for all fiber networks. At least as important as that is that all projects, all funded projects need to be capable of symmetrical 100 meg service. If not initially capable of symmetrical 100 meg service, they need to be initially capable of 100 by 20 service with a credible, clear, scalable path to providing 100 meg symmetrical service, including a service availability date for the 100 meg symmetrical service. Again, that's in ARPA, that's in the Treasury guidelines. The timeline here, the period of performance is 24 months after the full execution of the grant disbursement agreement. It's a fairly tight timeline. Again, that's in the enabling legislation. We'll go over that a little bit more, but basically the end of 2026, December 31st, 2026 is the current drop dead date, if you will. So there's a fairly aggressive timeline for this project. Possible extensions to the 24-month period of performance are possible due to delays not caused by the applicant. The project cost must be reasonable and proportional to the difficulty of the project. So we know as we're evaluating applications that 1 mile of construction does not equal some other mile of construction. We will be looking at all factors: cost of make ready, cost of construction that's required to be underground construction, We're not going to penalize any projects or applications or potential subscribers that just due to the fact that the construction is expensive due to no fault of the applicant, extensive make ready, extensive underground, what have you. We will have a close look at that. Affordability, applicants are required to participate in the Affordable Connectivity Program, the FCC's Affordable Connectivity Program. That's a requirement from the enabling legislation. Also, that's a scored criteria. There are a few opportunities for applicants to get points here. We are now in the day and age where affordability requirements are tied to infrastructure subsidies. And a letter of community support is a requirement. We want to see evidence of community engagement and community support. So some of the key documents to review and understand, and they will be published or already are published on the CBO Advance-CPF's website. The program guidelines, so the CBO Advance-CPF program guidelines. We also will shortly publish a guide to reporting and compliance for subrecipients. So any grantees or awardees technically are called subrecipients. The state of Colorado is the recipient. They're the recipient of the U.S. Treasury funds. And the grant disbursement agreement. There's going to be a draft grant disbursement agreement published to the Advance-CPF website. I will add to this the U.S. Treasury CPF guidelines is certainly a document that you want to review closely. It's actually not that lengthy. So there's going to be a number of reference materials directly on the CBO Advance-CPF website, and then also within our online grant portal, a link to which will also be on the Advance-CPF website. Within the grant portal itself are other key documents that will be necessary for completing the application. We're going to provide a program workbook, which is an Excel document, which is going to be the primary receptacle for financial information, including capital costs, essentially your bill of materials. We're going to provide a template that is a narrative response template. So any questions that require more lengthy narrative responses, we're providing a template for that. And of course, an eligible locations database. So we'll provide a geodatabase of all locations. And actually, technically, it will be not only eligible locations, but the ineligible locations as well. And I'll explain why we're doing that in a little bit. And a CSV file with by county with all of the locations and their disposition as well. And an admonition there at the bottom of the slide. Read and understand U.S. Treasury rules and guides for the ARPA Capital Projects Fund funding. In terms of grant eligible expenses, one-time capital expenditures, made after the date of the grant disbursement agreement execution and CBO authorization. You'll see the asterisk there. I'll go over what the asterisk refers to in a moment. Also, of course, on the Advance-CPF program guidelines, there's a detailed list of what are eligible and ineligible expenses, but basically one-time capital expenses. Facilities necessary to deliver last mile broadband service to unserved and underserved addresses. The grant funds will be provided on a reimbursement basis. So after post-award, there will be a process for invoice submittal and subsequent approval and reimbursement. So as for the asterisk on the item where eligible expenses include those incurred after execution of the grant disbursement agreement, just a few weeks ago on May 17th, the U.S. Treasury released a supplementary guidance. They are still releasing such guidance even this far into the ARPA process. And this supplementary guidance did indicate that Treasury will allow reimbursable expenses that were incurred prior to the execution of the grant disbursement agreement, as long as these were expenses that would have been incurred otherwise. So basically, this addresses supply chain issues, long lead times and allows applicants to use materials out of inventory, basically. I mean, that's not the only application of this, but the primary one. So if Treasury is going to permit this, then CBO will as well. And it's a recognition of the fact that the period of performance is rather tight. So project size, the maximum dollar amount that can be requested in any single application is $20 million. Remember the maximum, the budget here, the amount of capital projects fund available is 162. So in order to spread that funding appropriately over projects, $20 million is the maximum. But applicants can submit more than one funding request. In general, it's a good idea to be able to section out your larger projects, not only for this reason, for the Capital Projects Fund grant program procedures, but also, obviously, there's a large tranche of funding coming up, right? The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the BEAD program, will have substantial funding, and there will be very similar competitive grant programs under the BEAD program. And you want to be able to capture some of that money now and some of that funding under BEAD. So to be able to segment up your projects is a very helpful way of advancing here. No pun intended. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, the period of performance is 24 months after the execution of the grant disbursement agreement. Extensions to the period of performance may be available depending on circumstances. All funds must be expended by December 31st, 2026. That is in the US Treasury's Capital Projects Fund guidance. So that's explicit in the guidance. And recipients, and keep in mind, it is the state of Colorado that is the recipient. Any awardees to this program, grantees, would be subrecipients. But the way it is written is that recipients must return to the Treasury any grant funds that are not used by the end of 2026. That drop dead date is in the US Treasury guidelines. It's actually not in ARPA, and Treasury might have the discretion to grant extensions beyond that, but it be solely at US Treasury's discretion for any project extensions that go beyond December 31st, 2026. And we are certainly not planning on that being availability. So that is the period of performance that is relevant at this time. Brief depiction of the program timeline. Obviously, the application window opens this coming Tuesday, just after June 19th, and will remain open until August 21st. And after a period of time to appropriately review the applications, award announcements will be in the fall. Location eligibility. So as I mentioned briefly before, the American Rescue Plan Act and Treasury guidelines define eligible locations for this funding tranche, the Capital Projects Fund, as locations lacking access to reliable wireline service of 100 by 20 megabits per second. And they further define non-reliable wireline service as wireless, DSL, and older DOCSIS, specifically DOCSIS 2.0 and older. And it honestly doesn't appear as if any DOCSIS 2.0 systems are really relevant here, but this is the published criteria. Within that, as long as the state stays within these general parameters, the CBO has the discretion to prioritize locations for funding, and they have done so. We'll discuss that in just a moment. Also, in terms of eligibility, locations that have an enforceable state or federal funding commitment for, again, reliable wireline infrastructure capable of 100 by 20 are not eligible. We'll have an example of that in just a moment. And of course, when we're determining eligibility for any particular location, all locations, satellite service or any mobile service is not a consideration. Location eligibility is based on the FCC's broadband data collection data version 2, which was only just released on May 30th, I believe. I think as most attendees to this webinar probably realize, that data is not perfect. We know that. It is, however, the best location-specific broadband availability data that is currently available. It will improve over time, and version 2 of the BDC is much better than version 1, but it is not perfect. So as you are looking at the information that we provide for location eligibility, don't be shocked if there are some anomalies. It is based on the best data we have available, but our outputs are only as good as the inputs, and there might be some flaws. And there are some ways to address that, practically speaking, with network building. Largely, our concerns are to prevent any overbuilding of otherwise ineligible locations, and to be able to appropriately accommodate unserved broadband serviceable locations that might not otherwise be reflected. But location eligibility is at the address level. So this is, again, the new paradigm of specific addresses are eligible, specific addresses are ineligible. Of course, the alternative to that is the way the FCC conducted the CAF2 auction, the RDOF auction. So define a geographic area, census block, for example, and the obligation is to serve every broadband serviceable location within that area. We're moving to location by location eligibility, and this program is going to do that. All right, so we have 4 categories of locations: unserved, underserved, served, and funded. The first 2 categories could very well be called priority unserved and unserved. These names or these titles are the titles that are commonly used in this context, used by the feds, used elsewhere, and we are using them as well. But this is our way of, the CBO's way of prioritizing all locations within the defined criteria of the Capital Projects Fund. So eligible unserved locations are those lacking access to 25x3 service from any terrestrial provider. Underserved locations are those locations that have service of 25x3 or above from any terrestrial provider, but no service from reliable wireline broadband service providers. Okay. Ineligible served are those locations with access to 100x20 reliable wireline service or better. So basically what this means is those locations that have cable or fiber and reported speeds or the capability of those networks to provide 100x20 service. And ineligible funded are those locations with an enforceable federal or state commitment for reliable wireline service of 120 or better. For example, the recent RDOF auction, RDOF locations, census blocks that were assigned, if you will, at 1,000 by 500 optical carrier fiber to the premise RDOF awards are ineligible for this program. But those areas where there is an RDOF award that was wireless, so therefore it's not a reliable wireline service, remain eligible as long as there's no other service provider reporting service of 120 or better from a reliable wireline technology. Of course, there's been a little time that has elapsed since RDOF, so there might be some locations with RDOF funded blocks that are now reported as served that might not have been reported as served otherwise. Forgive me, I'm not sure if you see that. My apologies if that.
Timing is everything, isn't it, Fred?
No, I turned that application off and everything. I'm sorry about that. I will continue though. So just very briefly, the methodology for determining locations. We use the FCC broadband data collection data. And so for unserved locations, these are locations with speeds below 25.3 from any unreliable technology, quote unquote, unreliable. So that's 10 is DSL, 70, 71, and 72 are unlicensed wireless, licensed wireless, and licensed by rule wireless, respectively. And in this category, also any location that was reported only by satellite carriers in general include all locations, and some locations are therefore not included in DSL or wireless reporting. We made sure we included all of those. Eligible unserved locations are those locations above 25/3, I should say 25/3 or above, from any of the unreliable so-called technologies, DSL, all wireless technologies. It should be noted this does include locations that might have service reported at above 100/20, but those are from locations that are so-called unreliable or not reliable wireline, so therefore can be included for funding, but are in the underserved category so that they are not prioritized over those other locations that lack that service. Ineligible served locations are limited to those locations where on the FCC's broadband data collection data are listed as served by either the cable technology or fiber to the premise technology, 40 or 50 technology codes at speeds of 100/20 or better. And ineligible funded, as I just mentioned, are those that have an enforceable federal funding commitment. Also part of the program is the distinction between tier 1 and tier 2 counties throughout the state.
Fred, hey Fred, it's Tim. Can you just go back 2 slides? It might be a good time just to re-emphasize, the eligibility, please.
Yep.
If you could just run through that one more time, maybe touch on fixed wireless as well, please.
Sure, absolutely. I think maybe it's best to use this slide to expand on that. So for unserved locations, these are locations that are definitely do not have access to cable or fiber. So they do not appear on any of the filings submitted into the FCC's BBC program under the fiber or cable categories. So they are purely within either DSL or either of the 3 types of wireless or satellite only. Again, do not appear on any of the filings from cable or fiber. And these are the locations with speeds below 25/3. The next category is eligible underserved. This is basically the same data set, if you will, of the above category. So these are locations that do not appear on any BDC filing that is from a cable or from a fiber provider or filed with technology code 40 or 50. So these locations do not appear on any cable or fiber filing. They appear only on either DSL filing, unlicensed, licensed, or licensed by real fixed wireless or satellite. And they have speeds of 25/3 or better, but they by definition are eligible because they do not have reliable wireline technology, but they do have reported speeds of 25/3 or better. So this can include unlicensed wireless. It's not a requirement of the Capital Projects Fund to corral off unlicensed fixed wireless in any particular way. I know that's a factor in some other federal efforts, including the BEAD allocation for states, but that's not as relevant for the Capital Projects Funds. So eligible unserved are those locations lacking access to any fiber or cable, so-called reliable wireline service, but they do have access to the so-called unreliable service of speeds of 25/3 or greater. And some of those can be reported above 100/20, and they're still eligible because those 100/20 or better speeds are from so-called unreliable technologies. And ineligible served are those locations that are listed as served with technology code 40 or 50, 40 being cable, 50 being fiber to the premise. with access to speeds of 100 by 20 or better. And I think the ineligible funded is relatively self-explanatory. So in addition to eligibility by location, there is the distinction between tier 1 and tier 2 counties. On the Advance-CPF website, there is a graphical depiction of these counties by tier. The distinction between tier 1 and tier 2 counties: tier 1 counties are defined by those that lack a broadband subscription percent of above 85. So those with subscription below 85%. Broadband unserved, so no access to 25.3 or better below 75% as of the BBC June 2022 data. It includes the 5 counties with the highest number of unserved locations, again from the June 22 BBC data, and counties overlapping tribal lands. So the ramifications, or the real important point, is of the total budget, which is 162 million approximately. The tier 1 counties will be allocated roughly 75% of that. And in tier 1 counties, the required matching funds is 25% of total project costs. And tier 2 of the funding, if you will be available to all the tier 2 counties, as well as all of the remaining counties. So that the tier 2 allocation, if you will, is the remaining 25% of the CPF budget, which can be assigned to projects in tier 2 counties as well as other projects in tier 1 counties. It's important to note that the next large tranche of spending out of the IIJA BEAD funding will not be tiered as such. There are different rules regarding how the recipient in the state of Colorado can spend BEAD funding, and they have to follow a slightly different path. So this is specific to capital projects funds. And the matching fund requirement for tier 2 areas for this program, for the capital projects fund, will have a minimum matching fund matching requirement of 50%. Worth noting that for the upcoming Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act BEAD funding, there's a statutory requirement for matching funds of 25%, which I believe can be waived in areas that the NTIA designates as high cost, and we're still waiting on that specific designation. So apropos of the matching fund requirement, applicants may seek a matching fund waiver. Applicants may ask to provide less than the minimum required matching funds. They must explain why it is not feasible for the applicant to provide the minimum match, must document efforts to obtain matching funds, including but not limited to in-kind contributions, because at the very least we would expect to see the attempt to include in-kind contributions to provide some of the required match. The CBO may grant waivers to the minimum matching funds requirement, or to allow funds not provided by the applicant to serve as match. And the CBO retains the discretion to waive any amount of the match, partial waiver, or up to including the full amount of the match, if justified. I think it's worth noting that it'd be more credible to request a waiver of only a portion of the matching funds, and rather not all of it, and show some effort to participate in the matching funds process, and not simply file a matching funds waiver because the opportunity is available. The CBO expects to grant waivers only in special circumstances, when it's necessary to the program's success. The intention is to cover as much ground with the funding as possible, to serve as many underserved areas, locations as possible, and to make the CPF funding go as far as possible. And the inclusion of matching funds is a vital aspect to that. In order to be considered for a waiver, the applicant must describe the special circumstances underlying the request, how the waiver would be in the public interest, and how it would advance the goals of the CPF program. It's worth noting there's really no formula for the matching fund waiver. You do have to specifically, the applicant needs to specifically make their case as to why it's absolutely required in this situation. Some of the factors that might be considered are cost of construction, low density, extensive make ready, topography, geography, etc. If seeking waiver requests, do so by submitting it along with your application. Applications seeking and not receiving a waiver may become ineligible, largely for the not being able to provide evidence of having the matching funds available. And the CBO might prioritize funding applications not requesting a waiver over those that do. Applications will be stronger without a waiver request, and waiver requests really should show some attempt to provide the match, and again, including the attempt to include in-kind contributions. In-kind contributions need to be relevant, they need to be appropriate, but it's a good way to show an attempt to participate.
Hey, Fred, good
Yes, sir.
time here just to pause before we do the application review. Obviously covered a lot there. It would be good to jump back to the tiers and just maybe go through that one more time. I think we covered the match requirements pretty well, but there was a couple of questions just over the tier structure. Thanks.
Sure. Any specific questions or?
There was a question about what the difference is between tier 1 and tier 2. So I don't know if you're able to elaborate a little bit more on the difference between the two, Fred.
So the difference has to do with statistics for broadband subscription and broadband availability and total number of unserved locations. So the basic statistics that feed into the designation of tier 1 versus tier 2 have to do with broadband availability and broadband adoption. And of course, the fourth bullet has to do with counties overlapping tribal lands. So I think, to put it in very general terms, they're defined by level of need. I mean, that might be putting it in very general terms, but you'll find that tier 1 counties are, the ones that are far more unserved, less urbanized areas, less incentive for private industry to cover 100% of the costs necessary to deploy broadband infrastructure, areas in more need of subsidy for CapEx for broadband infrastructure, I think is a good way to summarize it. And the way that that's being addressed with the Capital Projects Fund Advance-CPF program is that most of the funding is going to be focused on or available to the tier 1 areas. 75%, or roughly $120 million of the $162 million. And tier 2 projects within tier 2 areas are eligible, but they have access to only a maximum of 25% of the CPF funding, or a maximum of $40 million. But that $40 million isn't dedicated to tier 2 counties. It can also be spent on projects within tier 1 counties. Again, I'll reiterate that once it comes time to spend the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act BEAD funding, the tier 1 and tier 2 structure will not be present, as far as I understand. And that's because the NTIA rules and the IIJA rules for spending the BEAD funding are quite specific, obviously outside of the scope of this conversation to go over them in any detail, but they're a little more prescribed than the spending rules for the Capital Projects Fund in terms of sequencing, how you can spend it, and then what you're allowed to move on to after you've spent the initial phase of funding. Are there any other questions that you would like to interject at this point in time?
Yeah, Fred, we do have one other question. I want to read out loud from the chat. Someone had asked, sorry, I'm scrolling up to find it here. What format, downloadable format will we'll be able to download in terms of mapping? So do you know what formats they'll be able to access?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, I'll give the caveat that I'm not a GIS engineer, although we have our GIS engineers preparing that data right now. We're breaking it down to packages that are available at the county level. So applicants don't have to download the entire statewide database. You can download all of the county databases if you want, but a geo database, a GDB file per county will be available, and a CSV file per county will be available. And that will include the and honestly, I'm not well schooled enough on GIS to be able to say exactly what is within the geo database file, but I think that's the alternative to providing shape files. If what we make available is not compatible with your GIS system, what have you, just let us know through the FAQ email address, but we're providing it in a very standardized format, a geodatabase. So inside of that, you'll get points. So there'll be the 4 types of points: eligible, unserved, eligible, underserved, ineligible, served, and eligible funded, with all of the attributes of those points. And the CSV file will have that as well. So there'll be a file with all of the locations, the 2 eligible types of locations, the 2 ineligible types of locations, a unique location identifier, so we can always identify the location by number, street address or address description. Some locations don't have what we might all think of as a complete street address. We are able to include those locations now. For the upcoming IIJA BEAD funding, eligibility is going to be limited to those locations that are recognized on the FCC's address database, but we don't have that limitation here for the CPF funding. Also included on that database, of course, will be the eligibility by category and the latitude and longitude. So you can map locations using the CSV file, you can map locations using the geodatabase file, import them into your GIS tools for high-level network design and cost estimation purposes.
And Fred, what's the planned date for those packages to be made available, please?
Those will be available through the online application portal. And so they'll be available on the morning of the 20th, because that's when the application will go live. We are still actually at this very moment, my colleague Sarah Mulholland is dividing the information up into the 64 county level packages. And because of licensing purposes, we're not able to publicly publish that information in a format that's available that the information can be downloaded for use, manipulated. And therefore we cannot publish it, but we can disseminate it. So by putting it within the ZoomGrants application, within the online application portal, we are technically disseminating the application and not publishing it. And that's why it's going to be available through the online application portal. And we'll have a look at that momentarily. Yes, I know everyone is eager to see that, but we're just less than a week away.
Very good. Got one for you just to think about. And if you want to punt on this one and answer it in writing, that's fine too. If part of the middle mile build that's required to provide last mile service would be point-to-point wireless, but the last mile build is fiber, would it still qualify for CPF funds as long as it achieves 100 by 100 megabit service?
Well, the application will be received and reviewed as long as it's otherwise eligible.
Right.
A few concerns there. I mean, and these should be relatively obvious. The throughput, the capacity limitations of the wireless backhaul link, and that's the effect of that on the throughput limitations on the last mile infrastructure. Yes, of course, if the standard is limited to the 100 meg symmetrical, that might not be an issue. If the last mile network is a fiber to the premise network, that application might not be able to get the points available for all fiber to the premise networks, because that it also includes the ability to provide a symmetrical gigabit connection upon or service upon initial deployment. So that application might not be able to get the points in that category, but might otherwise be conforming. But the ARPA legislation, as well as the US Treasury guidelines, are very specific, and they're adamant that the capital projects fund should be used primarily to fund all fiber networks. However, yes, it's, if that section of middle mile is not available via fiber at this point in time, then perhaps it can, that could be part of a project in the future, and we would definitely closely consider that application.
Okay, cool. So Fred, I think it's good to get yourself ready to start again on the scoring. I think we've addressed most of the questions. There was a couple on tiers, which I think CBO would need to address directly. So I think we're ready to start back on application review.
Wonderful. I think timing wise, we're doing okay so far. So carefully review the Advance-CPF program guidelines. Read it twice. We were fairly thorough, within which you will see the scoring section. And I'm just going to go over some of the basics of the scoring section. There are 7 categories that are scored. They're shown here. There's a total possible score of 200. And let's just briefly take a look at all of the scoring criteria. So I got one slide for each of these 7 scored criteria. The first one is titled Needs-Based Evaluation, total of 40 points available. Here, we're just looking for the emphasis or the focus of the projects on the eligible unserved locations. So of course, these are locations that can't even get 25/3 service. These might be locations that currently have access to satellite only. So basically the worst of the worst, or the unserved of the unserved. So for those applications that contain 100% of locations eligible, categorized as eligible unserved, you get the full points, 40%. I want to interject at this point something really important, and this will come up at least twice more in the presentation. You can see the double asterisk over here. And at the bottom, you can see incidentally passed locations are locations that are within 250 feet of the proposed last mile network path. So and that's relevant in general, but it's most relevant for this score criteria. And basically what that means is if you're looking for points in this category, 100% of the locations have to be eligible unserved. And if you have to build sections of your network, whether they're small middle mile sections or what have you, and you are passing by other locations such as ineligible served or ineligible funded, if those locations are within 250 feet of your path, then we will include that in this calculation, right? So we require you to submit a network path layer along with your high level design. And we'll have a look, we'll set a buffer of 250 feet. We'll ask you to set a buffer of 250 feet and include all incidentally passed locations. So we realize that being able to achieve full points in this category might be difficult, but surely some areas within the state of Colorado will qualify for that theoretically. Then this category simply descends by 10 points for each milestone your application's containing at least 80% up to 100% or just less than 100% get 30 points, 60 to 80% of locations categorized as eligible unserved, 20 points, and then 10 points for the next category down. But keep in mind that this includes locations of any other category, ineligible served and ineligible funded, that are within 250 feet of your network path. Second scoring criteria is the gigabit speed evaluation, as I alluded to while we were discussing that question. If your project is for a fiber to the premise system and you can provide symmetrical gigabit speeds with no data caps upon initial deployment, if you plan to provide gigabit symmetrical speeds with no data caps upon initial deployment, you will get 30 points. We want to see the deployment of fiber to the premise networks here, right? That's what ARPA asks for. That's what the Capital Projects Fund guidelines ask for. Third scoring criteria is the financial evaluation. So we're looking for cost efficiency here. I know there's some concern on this subject relative to the high cost of building in certain areas, whether it's because the make ready is expensive, because the utility poles are ancient, or because there's mandatory underground and there's really hard rock. So when we say cost efficiency, we're not looking for, you know, $35,000 to $55,000 a mile for aerial and you get points, or, you know, less than 150 grand a mile for underground and get the points. It's a case by case basis. So if there is extensive make ready that's required and due to no fault of the applicant or the potential subscribers that would be served by the project, we will take that into consideration. Is that a relatively challenging determination to make? Yes, but we will have the appropriate qualified people reviewing the applications for cost efficiency, and we will be very cognizant of the fact that 1 mile of aerial does not necessarily equal 1 other mile of aerial or underground for that matter. But we are looking for general cost efficiency, cost per unit, cost per type of construction. The fourth of the 7 scored criteria are the readiness to proceed, basically, technical and readiness evaluation. This is to do with the fact that the period of performance is only 24 months after the execution of grant disbursement agreement. It's rather aggressive. Yes, a potential extension is available if due to no fault of the applicant, but it's still a rather aggressive timeline. So we're looking for, I wouldn't say shovel-ready projects, but we're looking for evidence of readiness to proceed. We don't necessarily expect any of the permitting process to have started yet. I mean, that doesn't start until there's a guaranteed source of funding. We understand that. But in this category, if there is any preliminary work that has been done to prepare for permit application or anything related to that, make-ready applications, what have you, that would be helpful. If there has been any design work done past just very high-level engineering, that would contribute to success in this evaluation. But we're looking for evidence of readiness to proceed. We're looking for evidence of the ability to complete the project within the 24-month period of performance. Total of 20 points available in that category. The broadband deployment impact evaluation, a maximum of 50 points available here. This is criteria that is included specifically in the American Rescue Plan Act and the US Treasury guidelines. So this is rather project specific for the ARPA capital projects funds. These are addressing issues and concerns that were voiced by ARPA and the US Treasury. Most of the scoring criteria is I would say, overtly quantitative and pretty mathematical in a sense. This is a portion of the scoring criteria where in part it's a little bit more qualitative. It's just unavoidable, right? So part A, we're looking for the affordability of your lowest generally available service, non-promotional, so that's quantitative. And in section B, we are looking for the project impact, community impact. Will it improve the economic development potential for the area? Is it a high needs area? Does it coordinate with the state broadband roadmap? Does it help impact positively broadband adoption and digital literacy and such? So you'll have the opportunity to address each one of these issues in a narrative format to address this scoring criteria. The second to last scoring criteria is rather simple. Applicant designation. If the applicant is any one of these 5 types of entities, you will receive 10 points out of 200. And the last of the scoring criteria, again, I'll emphasize, and this is going to be very relevant with the next tranche of funding, the BEAD funding. We are in an era where affordability requirements are tied to broadband infrastructure subsidies. It is the new reality. And basic participation in the FCC's Affordable Connectivity Program and its successor program, right? That's in the underlying legislation, that's in the US Treasury guidelines. Participation in the ACP and its successor program is a requirement of ARPA. And in addition to that, there is these 2 opportunities for scoring. If the applicant is willing to commit to offering a service of at least 100 by 20 with no data caps, only to Affordable Connectivity Program qualified households. So you don't have to offer this service widely. You don't have to offer it to all of your subscribers, but you would have to offer it to ACP qualified households. But 100 by 20, no caps, that's fully subsidized under the Affordable Connectivity Program and the successor program. 20 points are available. And if you're only willing to commit to offering a fully subsidized 25 by 3 service with no data caps, you will get 5 points in this category. In addition to the scored criteria, there is a handful of unscored, or I should say just eligibility criteria, or at least the top of this. You can consider eligibility. Are you meeting the matching funds requirement? Or do you have an approved waiver? Again, be considerate of the waiver process. And the other criteria, this is not eligibility criteria, but we are interested to know whether the project is inside of any of these particular zones: hub zone, opportunity zone, enterprise zone, rural jumpstart. So there's a section of the application where you can easily provide this information. Okay, so the required application deliverables.
So Fred, might be just good to take a quick pause. There was a question, and I believe Judd is on. Maybe he can address this, just around confidential information, or information that I assume would be marked confidential. You know, that being detailed network plans and or financial data. Judd, do you want to tackle that one if you're on?
Yeah, and I just saw that, and I just posted something to the chat. So in the application, of course, we will publish the proposed project area and the maps and kind of the overall network, but just so that it can be challenged, because there will be a challenge by incumbent ISPs. But we don't plan to publish financial budgets, your actual budget detailed, which will be required in your worksheet or the workbook. But we don't plan to publish that. Now, my only caution there is, I guess somebody could CORA that, Colorado Open Records Act, but we don't plan on posting it or publishing it.
Thanks, Judd. And I think that answered the question. Just taking a quick, we confirmed, Fred, that both aerial and underground are obviously applicable, depending on the build, and could even be a mix. I wanted, Fred, there was a question about contiguous areas. Any feedback on that? I had stated that, you know, areas that an application doesn't need to be contiguous, but it could affect scoring if addresses were skipped. But maybe you wanted to add to that.
Sure, that's a really good question, actually. So an application can contain numerous non-contiguous areas. The option or the alternative to that is to have instead of numerous non-contiguous areas, they can be made contiguous by having the section of middle mile network, if it's required, that connects these non-contiguous areas included, but you would then have to put a 250-foot buffer on that, and the locations that are incidentally passed along the way would be considered as part of the application. The benefit to that is the middle mile segment, if required, would be eligible for funding in that case. It would be subject to review. And if an applicant were to submit an application containing numerous non-contiguous areas, it's only the infrastructure within the identified areas that are eligible for funding. So maybe there's a pre-existing middle mile network that can be used, and you can just sort of tap into it and serve various communities and not have to worry about the connectivity between one polygon to another. There's that scenario. There's a scenario where you can simply forego seeking funding for the connectivity between the discontiguous polygons, non-contiguous polygons, or you could seek funding for it and include it and put a 250-foot buffer. And that's 250 feet on either side, right? I mean, we want to see a path layer. You can see that here on bullet number 4. Make sure you include a path layer. We're anticipating receiving a high level design. So the path layer might be the center line of the roadway. If that's all we have, if you are able to choose a pole line and that's your path layer, that's fine. But put a 250-foot buffer on either side of that, and we would include those locations. But to answer your question more specifically, non-contiguous areas are eligible, yes, are acceptable as an
Thanks, Fred. And if you could just drop back to the scoring item number 2, just to emphasize the gigabit speed evaluation with fiber, and then we can get started. Yep. That's the one.
So this is an important point, because this is, a lot of broadband infrastructure grants, they're not really technology. They're more technology neutral, right? They're more performance requirements. As long as you can meet this performance requirement, it's not really a consideration what type of technology. But in ARPA, in the enabling legislation, and in the US Treasury guidelines, they're very specific. The intent and the written guidance is that the recipients, again, the state of Colorado is the recipient, should focus on funding fiber to the premise projects. It's very specific. So here we are simply recognizing that requirement of the capital projects fund spending guidelines and ARPA, and creating a vehicle to emphasize fiber to the premise projects. And the minimum speed requirement is, if you're installing a fiber to the premise network, unless you have the maybe not unique, but specific challenge of having to backhaul that network over a microwave link, which is unfortunate, but we understand that is occasionally the case, then being able to offer a symmetrical gigabit service should generally not be an issue. We obviously, the example of a microwave backhaul or a wireless backhaul fiber premise network has a unique challenges to it.
Yeah. Okay, we're ready to move on, Fred. Just so you know, your video is not on. I don't know if that's intentional or not, but just so you know.
Yeah, you prefer it on?
I'm just letting you know.
Thank you. All right, let me get back to where I was. Okay, so the required application deliverables, and I should mention we're getting to the end of block number 1 of the slides. We have a second block of slides. We'll be taking a little detour onto something other than PowerPoint for just a few minutes. But the required application deliverables, we're trying to make this as user-friendly as possible for applicants, and not leaving applicants in a position where they're unsure of whether they've provided everything they need to provide. So we're really trying to address that and make sure it's perfectly clear that the application has been fully completed. So we are providing a program workbook. We're actually going to have a close look at that in a moment. That's an Excel form, and that's going to be the primary receptacle for all financial information, capital costs, essentially your bill of materials, revenue projections, operating cost projections. It'll calculate a pro forma and such. We're also providing a program narrative template. So any questions that require sort of long form answers, a couple paragraphs, we're providing a template for that. So there's just going to be a placeholder for every narrative question that's that's required. We'll provide a template for the community support letter that is required. You do have to have a fully executed community letter of support. We realize that's a bit of a heavy lift. Actually, if you look at the program guidelines, you'll notice that there is a 60-day grace period, if you will, for the community letter of support. If by the time the application window closes, that community letter of support is not executed, you can upload a letter describing the state of the process, if you will, and you have 60 days after the application window to submit that. We realize that that might require a public meeting, maybe more than one. High-level network design, high-level network design. We have to know what, the basics of what is being, what funding is being requested for, right? So we want to see at least a point layer of the eligible locations to be served, eligible and unserved and underserved. We want to see the points included of any incidentally passed ineligible location that's within 250 feet of your route. And you definitely have to include a path layer. It's really important. I would hope to see a path layer that is detailed a little bit, right? Is it feeder fiber? Is it distribution fiber? If it's a PON network, XGS PON, or what have you, it would be helpful to see where the feeder fiber is, where the points, where the splitter locations are, where the distribution fiber is, where the service drops are. We realize that various applications might have various levels of high-level design, but at the very least include a general path layer. Also required are basically polygons of the proposed funded service area in GIS format. So generally, eligibility is at the location level. So your proposed funded service area areas are going to consist of a bunch of points, but we want you to draw polygons around those points and provide those as well. Those are primarily going to be used for the challenge process when we publish information on provisionally awarded projects and subject those areas to the nominal challenge process or the challenge process post-auction, post-award, excuse me. Instead of displaying just points, we want to do something a little bit more user-friendly and display proposed funded service areas, if you will. So this is a required upload. 1 year of audited financial statements, unless the applicant is not audited during the normal course of business, in which case provide 2 years of unaudited financial statements. And to the best of my understanding, audited financial statements would be required by the time of a grant disbursement agreement, but I defer to Judd or Allison about that. And an authorization to apply, simple form. We just want to make sure that we're receiving an application from that's fully designated by the applicant entity and not some rogue grant writer. Also, this is a really important point. So we are embracing the concept of application remediation. I know the first bullet is written in the sense that CVO reserves the right to work with applicants, and that's absolutely true, but we are willing to remediate applications to get them to the finish line if they are the right type of application, if they would otherwise score very well. If there are minor deficiencies in the application, we will work with applicants to remediate the application. The reason is it's the goal of this program to encourage efficient and all-inclusive network building. And actually this point that's mentioned in the second bullet is really important. I'm actually surprised I hadn't mentioned it before, but while this isn't like a rigid scored criteria, we want to try to accomplish universal service within logical geographic areas. Yes, these might be relatively small community level areas, but we want to avoid leaving these stranded locations that really should be incorporated into the proposed projects and not left for potential future projects. The fewer number of unserved locations that are left unserved as little islands or on the very periphery of funded areas become much harder to fund over time. So some of the application remediation will be to that effect. And during the application process, the CBO will reach out to applicants for the remediation. Just two examples of the possible types of remediation, just two examples. There could be other types of remediation, where applicants are asked to incorporate additional eligible locations, once again, to try to achieve universal service within smaller logical geographic areas, right? We don't want to leave unserved or underserved locations at the end of dead-end roads or at the edge of communities that are served from one direction, right, from one road, and they would not likely be served by a project that's coming in from the other side, so to speak. Or the corollary of that, the removal of addresses from an application that are determined to be served or ineligible due to an existing funding source. And this perhaps might come up during the challenge process. And the CBO will initiate requests for remediation directly to the primary applicant, the contact information provided, and applicants will be asked to respond in a relatively timely manner, typically within 10 business days. All right, so that brings us to the point of our application. I'm almost surprised that we were allowed to keep the Monty Python slide in here, but we're gonna eddy out for a moment, away from the PowerPoint presentation, and I want to show you some of the application material. I'm going to actually stop sharing for a moment and then choose another folder here. Give me just a second, folks. Whoa. Okay, I just needed to rearrange my desktop just a moment. Can I confirm that I'm sharing my screen again and it is the Advance-CPF website?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we're just going to take a little bit of a break from the PowerPoint slides. We do have a few more slides. My colleague Nicholas is going to present those after this, but don't want to cause death by PowerPoint. So I just want to show you some of the basic resources. I think that most folks should be familiar with the Advance-CPF website. This is your primary resource for this funding opportunity. This is the receptacle for most of the information that you're going to need to participate in this program, to submit an application, and to even participate in the post-award process. Obviously, the basic timeline is here. This section here, if you can see my cursor, the application coming soon, this is a link, or will be a link come Tuesday morning to the online application portal. And we'll go to this in just a minute. This link is not active yet, but it will be Tuesday morning. And of course, you have the grant program guidelines here. This is the CBO program guidelines. The Tier 1, Tier 2 map is here. The frequently asked questions. Frequently asked questions are a very good source of information. Sometimes information as important as in the guidelines or in the frequently asked questions documents. And of course, at the bottom, there's information, links directly to the U.S. Treasury Capital Projects Fund website, and in particular, the U.S. Treasury guidance for the Capital Projects Fund. If anyone wants to also read the ARPA legislation, the section for Capital Projects Fund, that wouldn't hurt, although that would be up to you. I will point out that additional information will be added to this webpage over time. For example, this webinar is being recorded, and that recording will be published here shortly. The slide deck will be published here as well. And going forward, other important things will be here. We'll publish as abbreviated as we can make it, a compliance and reporting guide. Warn you, it's not very abbreviated. A draft grant disbursement agreement will be published here in due time. And just over time going forward, there'll be important information listed here. But on Tuesday morning, this tab here coming soon, the application coming soon will be live. And let's just have a look at what will happen as you go to it. This is actually not, I think I was timed out of something here, so give me just a moment. Make sure that this is actually playing nice. Okay. I was timed out of the initial login page, so I did want to show that, but I will say that the very first time you go to the link, so once you hit this link, if you have not been to the ZoomGrants platform before, ZoomGrants is what we're using for the online grant portal, you will be taken to the initial login page. And if you have not logged in before, you will have to just register. It's super simple. You just enter your name, your email address, you assign yourself a password at that time. And once you have done that, you can then log in. And once you have logged in, you will have access to the CBO Advance-CPF application. I have started a test application just so I can show you, and I've just named it for its test application. And we're going to that right here. So this is the applicant's view of the application. This is just a test. This application will be made live on the morning of the 20th. The initial login page I was planning to show you, I'm not sure exactly what happened, but again, you know, it's super simple. If you have not registered with ZoomGrants before, it's a very intuitive: name, email address, password, click register, then you'll have your login credentials and you click login and you will be where I am right now. So this is the basic online application. Applicants have these 4 tabs to complete. Because of the program workbook template that we're providing and the program narrative template that we're providing, there's not a tremendous amount of material that's required in the online portal, but some. So let's go over it. On the very first tab, general information, this is where you put your basic contact information as well as basic grant information, dollar amount that you're asking for, dollar amount of matching funds, basic contact information. It's important to note that whoever does the initial registration for the ZoomGrants application is the entity or the person that is going to need to hit the submit button, right? So you can, as the primary registrant, you can assign collaborators that can help you complete the application and edit the application, but only the person who does this initial registration and login is going to have the permission to submit the application. Can you share your login credentials with somebody? Yes, I suppose that's an internal decision, but that is important to point out. Enter your address. If you happen to have more than one address, you can enter more than one address by entering one, clicking verify and save, and adding another address. Perhaps there's a mailing address and a PO box, what have you. And then here's your primary point of contact. So if there's a remediation request or what have you, this is who that request will go to. And if you want to assign collaborators to the project, again, collaborators can complete the application but cannot submit it. You just enter their information here. Once you have this fully filled out, you click invite, and another open line item will open, so you can add another collaborator. You can add several of them. I'm actually not positive if there's a a maximum number. But just keep in mind, this is where you add collaborators. As soon as they're invited, they'll receive an email from the online platform, and they can complete their login or registration, accept the invitation, so to speak. So first tab is very general information. The second tab, which is called project description, the intention of this tab is to collect information that basically contributes to like a really like high level executive summary of the project. So very brief description of the project. Really, this is, just give us the elevator pitch for the project. You'll have the opportunity to describe it in far more detail in other locations. Proposed last mile technology. We want to know route miles, right, of the proposed funded area, aerial and buried, unserved and underserved locations. Again, of course, this will be listed elsewhere. How many community anchored institutions will the proposed network connect? Are you in tier 1 or tier 2 counties or both? What counties, what communities? Waiver request and such. I'm not going to go over every single question. We really don't have the time, but this is some boilerplate information that we don't think is too onerous. And basically, as I said, mostly is in the realm of helping us understand, like at an executive summary level project. Before I go to the other tab, I want to point out something really important. On the top of this tab, the top of the project description tab, is the library. Okay, this is just a placeholder for now, but this is where the eligible location, I should say all of the locations, are going to be available. So inside of the library tab is going to be a link to a file transfer site, because the databases are so large, it cannot be just an attachment. And you would click on it, you'll go to the file transfer protocol site where you can download the geodatabases and the CSV files per county for all of the locations. And that will contain eligible, unserved, eligible, underserved, ineligible, served, ineligible, funded. So you'll have all of that data, and that will be right here in the library. Okay. The next tab, application questions, are the primary questions. Keep in mind, we're collecting a lot of information in the workbook and the program narrative. So I believe you'll have only 14 questions here total. Oh, we have 17 questions here total. Not a tremendous amount. And we have them in a couple categories: applicant information, project information. So again, a little bit more detail about the technology being used. Split ratio, we're anticipating a lot of fiber to the premise projects. We're anticipating a lot of PON projects. So we want to know the split ratio. And this is will help us with the scoring criteria. Excuse me. This is is this a fiber to the premise project that can offer symmetrical gigabit service with no day caps upon initial deployment? And then service offering, these are the two scored criteria that we reviewed earlier. Willing to commit to providing a fully subsidized service. Some information required or regarding the compliance and reporting information. So that's the application questions tab. At the bottom of these pages, at the bottom of these tabs, there's a next button you might have noticed. That simply goes to the next tab over. I'm simply choosing to go back up to the top, so a little bit more clarity. But the documents tab, let's have a relatively close look at the documents tab. So this is fairly important. And as you can see, the library tab is present on top of, I guess, on top of all of the tabs. So it remains fixed. So the database of locations is available at the top of each page. So the documents tab, I don't know why I continue to receive Teams messages. The documents tab is very important. So not only is this the receptacle to upload your documents, it's also the source of some templates. So all of the templates that we are providing to assist in application preparation are here. Other supporting reference information is going to live on the Advance-CPF website. That's more general reference material, more general supporting material. Inside of the online application portal is the supporting material that's necessary to complete the application. So we've provided a template for the applicant attestation form. We've provided a template for the community letter of support. We're providing a template for the program workbook. I'm going to open this one up in a moment, and we're going to take a closer look at that because this one's very important. And we're providing a template for the narrative answers as well. As you can see, several of these are required uploads. What that means is if you do not upload anything in this area, if it's marked as required, you won't be able to submit your application. So if it's marked required, there must be an upload associated with these items. Otherwise, there are, as you can see, several things that are on a case-by-case basis and apply only to certain applicants, that are in a certain position. And as you can see, there are quite a few optional uploads. And as you can see, some of them, especially the lower half of this list, they're associated with a very specific portion of either the narrative, so the narrative template, or, for example, there's a couple that are associated. For example, application question tab 11. So on the previous tab, we look back at question 11. Depending on how you answer the question, a document upload is required. So as you can see, there are quite a few of these optional uploads, but many applicants will not be subject to many of these uploads. And at the very bottom, you can see we're providing an application checklist for your convenience, where you can put check marks next to the required and or optional requirements for the application. And we do want you to upload that, mostly just for thoroughness. Let me have a quick time check here. All right, we're doing pretty well. So I'm going to open up two templates very quickly, one quickly, and then the other one not as quickly. And then I'll ask my colleague William to go over the program workbook in a little more detail. But let's have a very quick look at the narrative template, because we have time to do so. So if you click on the template, it basically does the download, right? And get rid of that. We've got the table of contents here on the left, but we have simply provided a narrative template for all of the questions that need to be answered in narrative format. If you were to comb through the program guidelines document with a fine-tooth comb, you would extract all of these requirements, but we've done that for you. And you really just need to go into the template and where it says type text here, put your cursor and respond to the question. Brevity is everyone's friend. There's no need to treat this as a dissertation. The more pertinent, applicable information, the better, but the less non-pertinent, non-applicable information, the better as well. So just answer these narrative questions to the best of your ability. But just did want to point out that we have the application template that is available. And what happened there? Yeah, there we go. Sorry about that. So, and as you can see, I'm not going to bother clicking on and downloading all of these. That might be a little too time consuming, but as you can see, letter of support, community letter of support is a template that doesn't have the Advance-CPF branding on it, because this should be basically placed on the letterhead of the jurisdiction you are seeking the support letter from. And everything else follows a similar profile. So let's look at the program workbook, because the program workbook is perhaps one of the most important aspects to this. So you click on the program workbook, it downloads here, you can open it. So once you download any template, program workbook or what have you, just save it on your PC or your local network drive, work on it at your convenience. And when it is complete, then just go back to the Documents tab in the online portal, go to the upload link and upload it. I will point out one thing prior to departing from that and asking William to expand on the workbook. I will point out one thing, the uploads, if you want to upload a document, there is a 4 megabyte file size limitation. So when you are uploading things such as your high-level network design, which must include a path layer, that's likely going to be in excess of 4 megabytes. So your other option, if you were to click on the upload link, this is what you get. You have 2 choices. You could either choose a file, excuse me. You can either choose a file upload, right? And then choose file to search your PC or your network drive, or you can provide a link to a file. So for files that are above 4 megabytes, put them on Dropbox or some sort of file transfer site and provide the link to the file transfer site for those particular applications, those particular documents. Okay, so this is the program workbook. I'm going to just point out a few things on the instructions tab and the locations tab, and then I'm going to ask my colleague William Ponder to go over the rest of it. William asked me to make sure I mentioned clearly that throughout the workbook, any cells that are shaded in blue or this bluish gray color, either of these 2 bluish gray colors here, are cells that should be filled out or could be filled out. Some of them are mandatory, some of them are not. So this is the key. Look for cells that have the shading, and those are cells that need input values. So we have a locations tab, an instructions tab, and there's instructions per tab. So I would highly recommend reading the instructions in their entirety. And then prior to filling out any particular tab, please refer to the instructions for that particular tab. It's not only helpful, I think it's vital that you look at the instructions first. And I will point out the locations covered tab. So this is going to be in substantially the same format as the CSV file that we provide. That will be in the library section of the online application portal. We're going to provide a CSV file per county for applicants' convenience. Once those files are combined, if they need to be combined, and then whittled down to the locations that are only the locations that are included in your project, which include incidentally passed locations within 250 feet of your network path, right? So here we are expecting to see, as you see, eligible unserved locations, eligible underserved locations, plus ineligible served and funded locations. And these would be limited to the ones that are within 250 feet of your proposed network path and all of your unserved and underserved locations that you're including in your project. But once you have that list finalized, then you can simply copy and paste it into the locations tab. And some of this information will feed into the rest of the workbook. And at this point, I'm just going to ask my colleague William Ponder to take a slightly more detailed look at the workbook. I will point out, though, that we are going to create and publish to the Advance-CPF website a standalone video in addition to this webinar video that is like a tutorial for the workbook itself. So William is going to do a video and he'll go over in a little bit more detail, and he's about to go over the data entry into the workbook. So I'm going to stop my screen share and ask William to initiate one on his end. And let's have a closer look at the workbook. And then we'll take a look at some compliance and reporting slides.
So we just had that, close this one out. We just had the locations covered tab there from Fred, where we'll put all the addresses and whatnot. From there, we get into the key data tab. So the idea is this is going to kind of be your ground central where you come to at the end and whatnot. Starting off, you're really just putting in, application name, project name, total miles for aerial and underground. It's going to populate based on the location data that you've entered in the last tab. So that'll give you the amount of ineligible, eligible, funded with the different categories and whatnot, as well as the amount of tiers. As you fill out the application further, it's going to be important to come back to this tab because it'll start to fill out like your grant amount per application, your total grant request amount, all these other, the total matching funds and whatnot. So the further you fill out, the more this will populate. By the end, though, this will definitely be a good summary tab to look back on. So going further, the first really big tab we have is the proposed services tab. In this tab, this is basically where you'll enter in all of the revenue buildups. So you have your locations built in here. Here you're going to type in, put in the individual passings for both residential and for business. Then below, for each specific kind of offering that you have, so for each specific speed offering, you would put enter the information here. So let's do the technology, and that might be fiber or whatever class of technology you have. The customer class, which might be residential or business, download, upload speed, etc. Whether or not it's a promotional item or not. And then for each of these quarters out here to the right, you would enter in the amount of subscribers that you're expecting to gain. So basically you should have your like 100 speed package, your 500, your 1 gig, whatever speeds you choose to go with, or packages or whatnot. But the idea is we should have that full scope of services shown, the amount of customers for each service and whatnot, and that should really give us a clear view into how the revenue is being built up here. We also have, if you have any kind of installation charges, anything like that, any kind of data charges, this would also be the places to include those as well. And so this is going to mostly be how we build up the revenue in this workbook. From there, we go on to the capital budget tab. So on the left column here, you're just going to enter in all of the individual items. In the right, on the cost category, you basically would go through here and then assign them to the particular item. Establish the unit cost, unit type, unit quantities, and that'll calculate out to the total. One kind of important thing to note here, a lot of times applicants will give us just one unit quantity with a huge unit cost. What we really like to see is a lot of unit quantities and really a lot of depth here. So the more depth you can give us, the easier it is to do our jobs and the less remediation we're going to have to do at the end. So definitely break this out as much as possible. Try to cover all these categories if you can. And then that will all filter up into the capital cost summary tab here. You can enter in basically a number here, the number here to fill in the amount of quarters that your particular project is going to go for. I think 8 is the maximum here, which we have above. Also, it's worth noting if you have any sort of long-term leases, contingencies, etc., this is also going to be the place to enter that information. And then here, you'd be entering in the timing of those costs. So say you did engineering and some of it was going to happen in Q1, some in Q2, some in Q3, you would enter those accordingly. From there, we also have the capital budget for the tier 2. So we basically separate out our capital budgets into each of the tiers. So you have all of your tier 1 here, all of your tier 2 here, and they're separated out by the tabs below. And then this builds out to the capital summary tab right here, the same way the previous one does. It basically works the same way. It's really just, your tier 1 and tier 2 addresses, which are going to have some slightly different financials to them. Next up, we have.
And I'll just mention very quickly that if your project is solely within, within tier 1 counties, you can simply skip the tier 2 tabs. It's just because of the different matching funds requirement. The most efficient way to handle that in this Excel workbook is to have separate tabs for each individual tier. But if your projects are wholly within tier 1 or tier 2 for that matter, just fill out the appropriate tier. You only use both tabs or both sets of tabs if your project is in both tier 1 and tier 2 areas.
Thank you, Fred. And then from there, we'll move on to the funding and sources and match tab. So here you'll enter in the total funding amount for tier 1 and tier 2. And then below you enter the funding source, and we have a lot of different options here. You can have debt, other match and whatnot. And this is kind of where you build out all the other funding you're getting, whatever match you're including and whatnot. Any kind of timing to those funds that you have could also be included here as well. And then that will populate the information here above. This also goes back on to eventually fill out the key data tab as well. So definitely important to fill that one out. After the funding sources and match, we have the in-kind match program, which would be any kind of shared assets and whatnot. Basically, this is you want to make sure that you have any of the capital items that would be taken off here still included in the capital cost. So we want to make sure we have full cost here, and then in-kind match, if you're having any of that, we would basically call that item out here, and that's going to subtract from the capital expenditures at the very end of the model. But basically just make sure that it's still called out in the main capital costs as well, if you were taking it out here. After that, we have operating costs. Operating costs works really a lot like the capital costs. We have some different cost categories here and a little bit less detail just because it's a little easier to do it this way. But we basically just enter in all your items, put in the cost categories, and then extend out for the period. You'll notice that this period should extend for the full 10 years since the project's gonna obviously have to extend for a good bit, unlike the capital cost. So make sure we get that full scope of project costs there. And then that will filter into a summary tab here, which will show all the different categories and whatnot. You don't have to do anything on this tab. This is basically just going to take the information you put here and filter this up into a nice summary table for us. We have the same thing here with tier 2 operating costs, and this works like capital costs as well, where you have your tier 1 on one side and your tier 2 on the other side. Both filters up to this summary table and whatnot. And that's pretty much there on the operating costs. And then once you've kind of filled out all those sections in the workbook, you get to the project cash flow. This is kind of where you're getting to the end of the workbook, the final output. Here, you don't have to input any of this information. It's going to fill out everything for you except for these blue tabs. If you have any interest expense information, income taxes, operating subsidy information, it's going to be relevant, repayment of debt, other funds and whatnot. This is going to be where you include that. Again, this isn't information that you necessarily have to include, but it would help us as reviewers if you could include it type thing. Basically, anything you can include, I would go ahead and include on these applications. It will make our process a lot smoother. And then right at the end here, we get to the summary output, and this will just be a clean view that summarizes everything from the workbook into a couple tables here. We split that out by tier 1 and tier 2, but that's pretty much the end of the workbook.
So William, I know that's a lot of information, but if you could just hop back to the
Sure.
the capital tab, and there was just a question on contingencies, and I have a recollection of that and where it's added. Yeah, thank you. And is that capped? I can't recall what our decision was on the contingency percentage.
The program guidelines states that reasonable contingencies are an eligible expense. There's no stated cap in terms of percentage of program costs. I think general acceptable accounting standards apply here. I don't know if I really want to state any particular percentage, or if Brandy, Mark, or Judd want to as well, or would want to.
Mm-hmm. And then the second part, just there was another question about poll study or poll make ready. You can see here on line 10 that is where you would enter in the expected costs of that poll study or poll make ready. So hopefully that answers the question for Black Hills.
Be entered on this tab, but it would sum up to this tab, if that makes sense. So you'd enter in the item here, and then under this cost category, you just want to make sure that you have the poll make ready, which should be right there. Were there any other questions on the workbook?
I don't think we have any more specifically on the workbook. I'm just taking a quick skim here. Miriam's been helping with some upload questions and stuff, but I think, William, if you're done, we can hand it back to Fred for the next progression, or over to Nick.
I would just add, William, if you can just toggle back to the proposed services tab.
Sure.
I would just wanted to point out that this tab is sort of dual purpose. It provides the revenue projections by service tier, by take rate over time, but it is also the portion of the application where applicants list the services that they will offer over the funded infrastructure. So it's tied into revenue projection. You know, it's a very logical tie-in, but this is where you should list all of the services that you intend to offer over the funded infrastructure. And if there are promotional pricing for some services right there, since we're asking for this to go out over 10 years, this one goes out 10 years, William, is that correct?
We have 40 quarters.
Yeah, 40 quarters. So obviously that means there could be or should be a blend of promotional and non-promotional, right? I mean, you might have subscribers on promotional for what, 12 or 24 months, and then they'll drop off and go on to the non-promotional price. I don't mean to go into too much detail. I just wanted to state that this is not only to help with revenue projections and contribute to the pro forma, but it's also where applicants list all of their proposed services. And remember that one of the scoring criteria is the cost of your lowest priced non-promotional service of 100 by 20 or better. So we'll look at this portion of the application to score that section of the application.
And then Fred, just for clarification, obviously if someone's in business already and has existing operational costs, we're only looking for an assignment, an indication of the incremental operational costs associated with the new grant operations, correct?
Sounds correct. I'll ask William's opinion on that.
Right, just whatever operating costs would go into that particular build, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's some, some bleed over some economies of scale from existing operations, but the accounting for that is, will be up to the applicant and then, up to the interpretation of the reviewer.
And then Fred, just because the 250-foot buffer is sometimes a little confusing, if you already serve areas with high speed, but those locations fall in the 250-foot buffer around the proposed build locations, will you still get 100% unserved, underserved points?
It's an interesting question. So if an applicant already serves certain locations that are within 250 feet of proposed funded infrastructure, that implies that those locations, these incidentally passed locations within 250 feet are not eligible. They're not seeking funding for them. And that means they're ineligible because they're already either served or funded.
Right.
That means they don't, I'm just sort of making a few inferences here. They don't have the infrastructure that funding is being sought for, or that's an interesting question. So, let me say that, as we are evaluating the applications, if there is a situation wherein an applicant thinks that the evaluation of the incidentally passed locations needs to be considered in a certain context, please describe that context and we'll evaluate it.
Yeah.
That scenario is rather specific, and I'm not sure I can answer that right at this moment. If you're seeking funding for infrastructure to pass already served locations, it kind of begs the question, why is that infrastructure in place already? Yes, it might already be maxed out. Yes, it might only be distribution fiber, and you need to pass it with feeder fiber. So there is the potential for a case-by-case situation. But if there's a concern over that, just please include information to that effect that we can consider.
All right. I guess I'll pass that back over to you, Fred, at this point. If we don't have any other.
No, that's good. Yeah, we have a little time left so we have a little over an hour. Nicholas, my colleague Nicholas Bornacle, is going to now do a little screen share of his own and discuss some slides to do with compliance and reporting. Keep in mind, this project is made possible with federal legislation, the American Rescue Plan Act, and the capital projects funds, which are administered by U.S. Treasury. So even though the funding is administered by the Colorado Broadband Office, this is essentially a federally funded project, and the compliance and reporting obligations follow. So I'll have Nick break that to you all.
All right, thanks very much, Fred. Yes, just as we've been focused on the the application phase of this process, just as important are the compliance obligations that apply to these projects under the Capital Projects Fund and Treasury guidelines. These have been touched upon earlier in the webinar, but by means of some disclaimers. The program parameters, as we've mentioned, are subject to the American Rescue Plan Act, U.S. Department of Treasury rules and guidelines, as well as other applicable federal and state requirements. And important to note, the information that we're presenting on these slides should not be considered legal advice, and you as grantees are encouraged to consult your own legal counsel. And in the event of any discrepancy between the information presented here and the aforementioned statute, rules, and guidelines that have been published, those published guidelines from the Treasury, ARPA, and federal and state requirements will control. And I've included a couple of links to both the Colorado Broadband Office website for the Capital Projects Fund program, as well as the U.S. Treasury website linked to their capital projects page, at which you can find all of the information related to the program and Treasury guidelines, and that website is continually updated. As has been referred to previously as well, there are a number of key documents that apply when determining compliance and trying to be compliant in the program. Among them are the program guidelines, the Advanced Colorado Broadband Grant Program Guidelines, which are currently published to the website. The second item is a forthcoming publication of the Guide to Reporting and Compliance Obligations for the Advanced Colorado Broadband CPF program awardees, which will be published at a future date. It's a very detailed document that is built off of the compliance documents and resources that will be referenced in an overview form in this webinar. In addition, there's a note here at the bottom of this slide that grantees should read and understand the Treasury guidance related to CPF projects, and we've included the URL to that particular resource at the Treasury's website. The first topic relates to post-award reporting and monitoring, just in general on this slide. As mentioned, the oversight of your projects after an award is made is equally as important as the process of selecting and awarding your projects. And some of the very high level, some of the items involved in that process are the submission by grantees of network designs and as-builts, as well as a review of expenses and requests for reimbursement. In addition, there will be quarterly progress reporting from grantees to the CBO so that the CBO can meet state and federal obligations under the program, as well as field audits, which are part of the process to verify that the application that you presented and the construction of your project is complete and of sufficient quality. And lastly is a requirement of participation in the state broadband mapping. In looking at the compliance obligations, it's important to look at the various levels when talking about compliance. There are essentially three levels related to the Capital Projects Fund awards. They come from the federal agency, which is the U.S. Treasury at the top, if you look at that diagram on the right, down to the recipient level, which is of the Colorado Broadband Office. And then the final level is the subrecipient level or the grantee level. And it's important that subrecipients and grantees at that level comply with the terms and conditions of your award, any statutory and regulatory requirements, as well as Treasury's requirements related to subrecipients, many of which we'll touch upon in the forthcoming slides. Also important is that to work with the Colorado Broadband Office to supply them with any and all of the information that they will request at various intervals so that they may fulfill their reporting requirements to the Treasury from the recipient level. Important to note is the definition of internet service providers. Treasury released some fairly recent guidance approximately a month ago related to broadband projects for both their capital projects fund and state and local fiscal recovery fund programs, which define internet service provider subrecipients fairly broadly, more broadly than most people intuitively think of them, in that they are ISP, the term ISP includes, for purposes of the Treasury's guidance and compliance, subrecipients and contractors who install broadband infrastructure using CPF funds. And it's not limited to entities providing retail internet access service. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the overall reasonable and allocable requirements that apply to costs for eligibility for reimbursement under the program. The broader federal uniform guidance requirements, under that, costs need to be necessary and reasonable in order to perform the federal award. They need to be incurred specifically for that federal award, and there needs to be adequate documentation of that. And on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see that the CBO has program requirements that are more specific than those federal uniform guidance requirements in that, and as they relate to certain items, particularly operating expenses, which are ineligible, and this is covered in the program guidelines, as well as internal admin expenses, administrative expenses are also ineligible uses of funds. Internal labor costs, however, if incurred as part of eligible project activities, are reimbursable only up to the time spent on project activities in the period for which reimbursement is sought. Finally, an overarching principle is that this program looks at actual costs, and the Colorado Broadband Office only will reimburse for actual costs that are incurred by grantees. And any costs that appear excessive or are without justification, and costs that fall outside of the eligible cost categories will not be reimbursed. This slide speaks to some of the general compliance obligations. And again, I would refer grantees to the CBO's guide to reporting and compliance obligations at the web, which will be posted to the website in the coming days for this project, this program. And among those requirements are the state broadband reporting requirements. I've included a statute citation, record keeping, ongoing record keeping obligations, the submission of project data to the CBO for both quarterly and annual reporting, so that it may fulfill, as we mentioned earlier, it can fulfill its reporting obligations up to the Treasury. In addition, there will be internal controls and monitoring of awards associated with these projects, and the single audit requirements of 2 CFR subpart F, the uniform guidance, which apply to, we'll get into a little more detail on those audit requirements, but they apply only to public, nonprofit, or tribal grantee subrecipients. Related to labor, the Treasury encourages strong labor practices in its compliance guidance, as well as compliance with all applicable federal laws and regulations. And related to, this touches upon Davis-Bacon, but Davis-Bacon does not apply to capital projects funded solely by capital projects funds. However, there is a labor reporting requirement which touches upon prevailing wages. So if your project is receiving $5 million or more in capital projects funding, you may provide a certification regarding prevailing wages, that all contractors and subcontractors are paid prevailing wages, as well as certifications regarding project labor agreements if you don't provide that certification regarding prevailing wages. In addition, they will request, or Treasury requires in the quarterly reporting, questions regarding to be answered whether the project prioritizes local hires and whether projects have a community benefit agreement. Related to record keeping obligations under this program, it's important that registration and obtaining a unique entity identifier at sam.gov. This registration requirement must be obtained by grantees. All grantees must have an active registration with the System for Award Management at sam.gov. And I wanted to emphasize that grantees should try to register as soon as possible for this unique entity identifier at sam.gov if they have not already, as there can be some long lead times associated with obtaining that unique entity identifier. In addition, for the record keeping requirements, there is a 5-year requirement that grantees maintain records and financial documents for 5 years after all of the funds are expended and or returned to Treasury. And related to the collection of data and information from subrecipients, CBO may request that subrecipients and grantees submit data for post-award compliance reviews as necessary. We mentioned the audit requirements in terms of the Single Audit Act as applicable to the nonprofit public grantees. However, on this slide, we focus on the audit requirements for that apply to for-profit grantees, as these grantees, for-profit grantees, the for-profit entities that receive these subawards are not subject to the single audit requirements, in contrast to those public nonprofits. However, they are subject to other audits and monitoring as deemed necessary by governmental entities. I've listed a few below this in the latter half of this slide. OIG, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, or the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. And as a further note, CBO, as part of its requirements under the uniform guidance, they will ensure compliance by for-profit grantees through mechanisms like pre-award audits, monitoring, and post-award audits. And this is these are the single audit requirements which apply to the public, nonprofit, tribal grantees. Those obligations kick in when, if you are a public nonprofit subrecipient, if you expend $750,000 or more in federal grant funds in a single fiscal year, then the uniform guidance single audit requirements, which are covered in subpart F, will apply. A summary of those requirements will be in the Guide to Reporting and Compliance Obligations in Appendix A, and those are also included in detail in the section of the 2 CFR 200 subpart F, which you can refer to. In addition, public, nonprofit, tribal entities are responsible for obtaining those audits. Under the federal procurement requirements, Treasury has recently released some guidance beneficial to ISPs under fixed amount subawards. And the vast majority, if not all of the awards that will be part of this program will be fixed amount subawards. And importantly, if you're an ISP receiving a fixed amount subaward, you're not required to comply with the detailed uniform guidance procurement practices of the uniform guidance 2 CFR 200. And however, it is important to note that your own procurement requirements will still apply, as well as any applicable local and state procurement requirements. So it's just the uniform guidance, federal procurement practices that our ISPs who are receiving a fixed amount subaward under this program would be exempt from. Related to bonding requirements, if under the state law, if you are undertaking a construction project above $150,000, there are minimum bonding and insurance requirements, including performance and payment bonds on the part of the contractor for 100% of the contract price. Related to property, this is another area where the U.S. Treasury has provided some very recent guidance related to ISP, Internet Service Provider grantees under fixed amount subawards. The vast majority of awardees under this program, as I understand it, will be such grantees. And this relates to the federal interest. If you're in the broadband infrastructure, if you acquire broadband infrastructure or improve it as part of this program, the CPF program, the federal interest in that will expire on December 31st, 2034, provided that the project, your project is completed by December 31st, 2026, which is the end of the Capital Projects Fund period of performance. So title for these grantees, title to the real property or equipment acquired or improved will vest in the ISP, in that ISP, subject to, there are 9 conditions that are provided in the Treasury's May 17th supplementary broadband guidance. And those are at the link provided. Rather than reproduce them on this slide, you can refer to those conditions. And if those are met, ISPs are required to hold project property in trust for the beneficiaries of the project. Property may be encumbered by the ISP if Treasury receives a shared first lien position, and such that in the event of foreclosed, the property is foreclosed upon or liquidated, then Treasury receives the portion of fair market value equal to Treasury's percentage contribution. And important to note on this point is that if you're an ISP and you don't comply with the 9 conditions listed in the supplementary guidance, then some additional requirements will kick in under the uniform guidance, and those relate to disposition of property. Related to program income, the recently released guidance that the Treasury has provided in the last month noted that income that's generated by ISPs from their subawards will not be considered program income, and that ISPs may use that income without restriction. In addition, related to indefeasible rights of use, IRUs, and leases related to broadband, income from those IRUs and leases will also not be considered program income under the latest guidelines. A note about civil rights compliance related to these awards. The grantees are required to comply with all federal and state laws, rules, and regulations that prohibit any unlawful discrimination or violations of civil rights. And I've listed a number of those below. I won't read through them all, but they're on this slide for your reference. In addition, the CBO may request from grantees and subrecipients that they provide information potentially describing the subrecipient's Civil Rights Act of 1964 compliance status. And there's more detail on this that will be in the Guide to Reporting Compliance Obligations that will be posted in the coming days at the CBO website. Related to procurements, there are requirements that will apply related to the National Defense Authorization Act. What this involves is procurements. It's a prohibition against using grant funds to procure, obtain, or extend a contract to procure or obtain equipment, services, or systems that use covered telecommunications equipment produced by certain companies, and those companies are listed at the FCC website, and I provided a link of the up-to-date covered equipment and services list of prohibited companies. As has been noted previously, up to this point in the webinar, the Affordable Connectivity Program is also, participation in that program is also a requirement. Grantees must participate in the FCC's current Affordable Connectivity Program. This previously was the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, and this will apply to any successor program of the FCC's once that time comes. Quick note on taxability of federal awards. This is an area that is a changing and developing area related to broadband grants, but currently, in the absence of additional forthcoming guidance and legislation, broadband grants are viewed by the IRS as being generally taxable. So until such point as the Treasury will establishes otherwise, grantees are responsible for including or reporting their ARPA-funded grants as gross income. And there has been a bill that has been introduced in the Senate, but nothing has come of it at this point. But late last year and early this year, a bill was introduced which would change that stance of the taxability of federal awards. Again, though, this is not, we're not providing any actionable tax legal advice here. This is just for informational purposes, and grantees should consult their own tax counsel in making decisions. The next section of the compliance slides relates to the general notices to proceed process that the CBO will employ in processing these grants. Essentially, prior to construction, CBO will require grantees to complete a number of requirements, and this process may include but not be limited to two overarching steps, essentially two hurdles. One would be the notice to proceed with pre-construction activities, and then the second would be a notice to proceed with construction activities. And this first slide depicts an example notice to proceed with pre-construction activities. So what would occur first on the left-hand side is a grantee would submit a request for approval and include necessary supporting documentation that will be defined per your grantee's grant agreement with the CBO. And then at that point, if everything is complete, a notice to proceed with those pre-construction activities will come from the CBO. And at that point, the awardee may begin to spend on these pre-construction type activity costs. And some examples of that are engineering functions, costs related to permit applications, right-of-way practices, activities, and similar logistical efforts. And this next slide depicts the full sort of spectrum of the process. Initially, the notice to proceed with pre-construction activities is that first step. And once that's obtained from the CBO by a grantee, you as grantee can spend your match at that point. And at that point, you'll be required to submit an engineered design which is required prior to requesting a notice to proceed with construction activities. And you may request, as a grantee, you may request grant funds for construction activities only after also receiving a notice to proceed with construction. And once that's received, you may begin your construction activities once the notice to proceed with construction. And if as a grantee you don't spend your full match up front, you may submit a match in proportion to the amount of reimbursement requested in a given month. This, I think this is the last, one of the last slides related to the notice to proceed process. Related to the notice to proceed with construction in particular, here are some of the potential preconditions, steps that may be required depending on where a project is located prior to making that request. And they include items such as DOT permits, fully engineered, submitting a fully engineered design, providing any dig once notifications if they apply to a project, easements, land acquisitions, and right-of-way obtainment, and any pole attachment agreements prior to requesting your notice to proceed with construction. And that it's important to note again that the grantee must wait to receive that written notice from the CBO prior to beginning construction. Related to the engineered design that's part of this process and the submittal of that network design documentation, those designs will need to be prepared under the review, and this is included in your the program guidelines. Those designs will need to be prepared under the review of a professional engineer or an engineer with substantial demonstrated experience designing cable or fiber networks, whose credentials are submitted along with that design. And however, this review requirement may be waived by the CBO for projects awarded less than $1 million in grant funding, so as to facilitate projects that have a rapid construction schedule. And related to that, the timeline to project completion, and this is outlined in the program guidelines, as well as the grant agreement that will be between grantees and the Colorado Broadband Office. Projects must reach completion within a certain time frame, and that time frame for all projects, the construction must be able to be completed and ready to serve customers within 24 months from the time of award, and extensions for an additional up to 6 months may be granted for delays not caused by the grantee. In addition, related to customer drops at targeted addresses, requesting new service, those are eligible for reimbursement within 24 months of an award. The next item in the compliance section relates to the quarterly progress reports. What's included in these quarterly progress reports are essentially current and cumulative to date information on certain key project metrics. It's a form that will be submitted by the CBO to Treasury prior to the end of the month following the close of each quarter. As such, because there's this reporting requirement from the recipient, the Colorado Broadband Office, to the Treasury, CBO will require information that feeds into that quarterly report to be reported by grantees and subrecipients ahead of that deadline, ahead of that end of the month before following the close of each quarter. And quarterly reports will begin, that reporting period will begin immediately upon execution of the grant agreement. And as an overview of some but not all of the data that will be covered in the quarterly reports related to awarded projects, this includes project level data, including project technology types, planned and actual, total miles of fiber deployed, planned and actual, the total number of locations served by a project, both planned and actual, and total number of locations served broken out by speeds, and looking at it from a pre and post CPF investment perspective, as well as the total number of funded locations served broken out by type, planned and actual. In addition, the quarterly reporting data will include items, information related to the speed tiers offered and pricing, as well as location by location project information. And included in that location by location information is the technology used to offer service at a particular location, the location type, the speed tier at that location, pre-CPF ARPA investment, and the speed and latency at the location after ARPA investment, and which is the maximum download and upload speeds offered and delivered. Related to speed testing requirements, speed and latency tests are required by the Treasury to be from the customer premises of an active subscriber, and 95% of latency measurements must fall at or below 100 milliseconds round trip time. In addition, these Treasury guidelines are based on a couple of FCC orders. I've provided the links below to those orders, the 2018 and 2019 FCC orders, and those detailed requirements touch upon items such as the endpoints for testing, the daily test periods, having at least one download and one upload test per testing hour at each subscriber test location, the number of test locations, which will vary depending on the number of subscribers in a state, as well as requirements related to testing frequency. FCC requires quarterly testing for speed and latency, and some information related to flexibility and choice in testing methods used. Under the state requirements, I would note the state is requiring that these speed tests be conducted by a third party. And it's also important to note that related to cost associated with speed testing, it is viewed as an eligible expense. The next group of slides relates to environmental and historic preservation compliance under these programs. Related to federal and environmental law compliance, awardees must comply with all applicable federal environmental laws, and Treasury provides a capital projects fund environmental checklist to help determine whether certain environmental laws apply to its projects. And some of those potentially applicable laws are listed below. It's important. It will be very helpful for grantees to utilize the checklist, which will be included as a part of your a part of the compliance and reporting items to help you through that process in identifying applicable federal environmental laws. Related to NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act applicability, with regard to Treasury, I just wanted to note that NEPA, if a project is funded solely out of Capital Projects Fund, Treasury funding, and it does not involve a government body that's subject to NEPA or another source of funding subject to NEPA, NEPA will not apply. Now, related to permitting requirements, it's important for grantees to know that they're responsible for complying with all applicable permitting requirements for your infrastructure, your broadband infrastructure projects, which will occur in various rights of way. And some examples of those are right-of-way permitting related to the Colorado DOT processes, dig once, utility, and special use permits are involved in that, as well as any underlying municipal, county, state fees, permits, and approvals. And finally, if your project is within a federally designated land, there may be some federal agency approvals that may apply to your project. Related to historic preservation, under the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106, subrecipients and grantees will be required to consult with the Colorado Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation to comply with the Section 106 process. Some of the information that is included as part of this process is available. I've included a link to the History Colorado website, as well as the consultation guidance links below at the bottom of this slide. But some of the information that's included as part of that process is related to project descriptions, location, what buildings are in the vicinity, information related to ground disturbance and previous site uses, the establishment of what's called an area of potential effect, the completion of inventory forms, as well as information on buildings, structures, or archaeological sites within the area of potential effect, and consultation with the local government in the area where the project is located is also part of that process. The last group of slides that we'll go through here relates to the notice of completion and final technical reviews related to your project. After an award, after the disbursement of grant funds will require submission of a proof of expenditures on eligible costs for review, and awardees are required to cooperate with field audits in order to verify that the construction is complete and of a sufficient quality. And in addition, awardees will need to submit as-built network documentation prior to final closeout of the grant. On the left hand, continuing with the post-award compliance, this involves an as-built review. So a completed set of design documents will be compared to the original submitted design to ensure that the program guidelines are met, as well as a verification of past addresses. And a review of splicing tables will ensure that the fiber counts are sufficient to provide for sustainable service, as well as allow for future growth. On the right-hand side, related to the desktop technical review, will be included the review of the design integrity and functionality, network architecture, any signal loss outcomes for fiber coaxial, verification of CPE practicality, the applicable transport backbone support for expected traffic, and a review of splice case photos and test measurements, OTDR, identified via geocoding and or field location. Related to the field validation piece, there will be on-site visits to each awardee in order to evaluate OSP hub sites and field equipment installation. Awardees will provide a representative for a ride-out review of the construction initiatives. A remediation request will be provided for items in need of correction, and applicable items to be reviewed include the following list of items, including but not limited to this list on this slide. Related to the post-award compliance, there will also be a project spending review, which is a final review of project expenditures, including verification of the invoices submitted in your grant reimbursement request forms. In addition, explanations and remediations will be provided by the awardee if any anomalies are identified. And a verification of purchase materials will be completed based on the field validation review. And that concludes the compliance section of the slides.
Thank you, Nicholas. We really appreciate that. Again, the slide deck and the recording of the webinar will be posted on the Advance-CPF website. And the compliance reporting guide that Nicholas prepared will shortly be published there as well. And strongly encourage you to refer to those, as well as the Treasury Capital Projects Fund guidelines. So we have, actually, we're almost, surprisingly, almost right on schedule. We wanted to leave a block of time at the end for questions. Tim and anyone from the CBO, Mark, if you would like to want to go through some of the questions in the chat that we haven't either haven't been able to respond to in the chat or are worth addressing at this stage anyway, just to highlight that you'd like to call out.
Fred, there might be an easy one just for maybe CBO to knock down about Buy America. I don't know if there's specific guidance around that, but that we have to release. I don't know if Nicholas knows the answer to that either, but there was just a question about whether we'd be releasing any guidance around the BABA program.
Yeah, I'll ask Nicholas to correct me if I'm wrong, but the and at least one of Nick's slide had to do with the restricted vendor provision, and to the best of my understanding, I'm not sure if I can be so definitive as to say there's not a Buy America provision associated with capital projects funds. I believe there will be with respect to the BEAD funding, but rather than a Buy America provision, there is the prohibited vendor list, so to speak, a blacklist of a few particular vendors. Is that correct, Nick?
That's right. Yes, the Build America, Buy America Act is not applicable to the Treasury projects. However, there is an encouragement or a preference that in certain contracts that there's a preference for domestically produced purchases of materials. And aside from that, yeah, the Build America, Buy America is primarily geared toward the NTIA, IIJA programs. There's some specific information in a Treasury FAQ that noted that that Build America, Buy America Act doesn't apply in the same way to Treasury projects as it does to the Commerce NTIA projects.
I'll add to that too. And I saw that Allie Terry is on the call. So Allie, feel free to add, but the CBO is creating a series of short trainings on federal compliance, and Buy and Build America is one of those trainings that's currently available. I dropped the link in the chat if you want to access that, but there's a short overview of that already up there, if that helps.
So Fred, here's a good one I think you might be able to answer. Are there any restrictions for service providers who are receiving ACAM2 funds from applying to CPF?
No, the only relevant eligibility concerns is at the location level. Does the location that funding is being sought for have an enforceable federal or state commitment for funding for reliable wireline infrastructure capable of 100 by 20 service? But and Mark points out that ACAM2 is addressed in the most recent or a recent frequently asked questions document.
Yeah, and then Fred, I know we specifically request identification of community anchor institutions. Is there any specific additional scoring around that?
No, there's not, but there's certainly an interest in knowing the extent to which community anchor institutions are impacted by the projects.
Okay. And I know that we've talked a lot about disputes. What does the process look like at a stage when a competitor might dispute a grant application, another entities grant application?
So the challenge process would be limited to whether there is infrastructure that's present at the disputed locations, whether it's infrastructure is present that is reliable wireline infrastructure capable of delivering 100 by 20 service. There is a provision in the challenge process that is described in the guidelines document wherein a service provider can challenge based on the credible claim that there's plans to build out in those locations, to those locations within the next 12 months, but the evidence required for a commitment to build is significant, right? I mean, that's a type of claim that is sometimes used in inconvenient fashion, and the evidence to support that claim needs to be pretty solid. But that's what disputes come down to is the eligibility for individual locations at the location level, and whether that location is eligible vis-a-vis the ARPA Capital Projects Fund rules.
Okay, thanks. And then there was some questions around the tier structure, which I think we had heard earlier, which I think is probably best addressed and maybe in writing offline by the CBO, unless anybody wants to tackle that now. And just Lauren's skimming through here to see if there's any others you want to pick up on.
Yeah, I do not. I don't know if my team, Mark or Ali, have seen any in there as well. But yeah, like you said, we'll make sure we capture everything and address them in the FAQ that we'll post, as well as post all of the recordings and the webinar slides, so everyone will have access.
Okay, I see.
Yeah,
just
one
a
question just popped up.
new question in the chat about what about challenges between two applications for the same area. So that's a good question, and that wouldn't necessarily fall in the realm of challenges. That will fall in the realm of remediation. So in the application review stage, if there are overlapping applications, and that's a strong possibility, we will attempt to remediate the applications to accommodate the overlap. So what does that mean in practical terms? Yes, one applicant might be asked to shrink their application. It also has to do with other criteria of each application, right? Not just that they're overlapping, but how do the applications fare in terms of scoring relative to all other applications, relative to the budget. But overlapping applications in terms of overlaps of locations where funding is being sought, that will be we'll attempt to deal with that to completion in the remediation phase.
Thanks, Fred. And Fred, could you just address the last question that's just come in from Peggy, because it did come up earlier and maybe she didn't get the correct answer. So if you want to tackle that, that would be great.
Can the low cost option be offered only to some kind of qualified household, like maybe ACPF free or reduced lunch or some of the criteria, or does the low cost option have to be offered to everyone? So I think this is referring to the scored criteria for a fully subsidized service, fully subsidized under the FCC's Affordable Connectivity Program. I'm making that assumption. There's another scored criteria for your lowest priced, basically the affordability score for the lowest price, generally available non-promotional speed. For that one, that has to be a standard service, non-promotional and offered to your full subscriber base. But that's not the subsidized service. For the fully subsidized service portion of the application, remember that general participation in the FCC's Affordable Connectivity Program is required by ARPA, required by US Treasury. And a scored criteria for this program is if the applicant is willing to commit to offering a fully subsidized service to ACP qualified households. Then you get, I believe it's 20 points for 100 by 20 service and 5 points for 25 by 3 service. For that service, that fully subsidized service would need to be offered only to ACP qualified households. For the other scoring criteria, which I think has basically fewer points available to it, it's your lowest generally available non-promotional service of 100 by 20 or above, just the general ranking of your affordability. That is a generally available service, has to be generally available to all your customer base.
Okay, Fred, I don't have anything else for you or William or Nicholas at this time. Thanks.
Okay. Wonderful. Yeah, if there's anything else that Mark or Judd or Lauren, if you'd like us to cover, I think we have a question or two regarding tier 1 or tier 1 versus tier 2, if you'd like to address that. Obviously, a few questions we've received can be addressed in the next version of the frequently asked questions document.
Hey Fred, I'll just jump in on the tiers because it comes up a lot, and we've already kind of talked about it earlier. We do have a methodology listed on the map as well as in our guidelines on how we distributed the funds. It's based on data. We are using the FCC's most recent version of the map. And in the Colorado Broadband Roadmap, there's a strategy in there that speaks specifically to looking at opportunities to target funding in areas that are really, really difficult to serve. And I realize there's unserved and underserved all over the state. We have that data. But, we looked at it from a really high cost threshold perspective, as well as data. So the map that's up there has been updated and is the map that's going to be used for the Capital Projects Fund program only. It is not going to be used for BEAD. So we also include this answer in our Q&A. So if anybody needs to look at it or hasn't looked at it, we've explained, how the tiers work, the data that's behind it. The most recent map is the most recent data from the FCC. And so it is not going to change. So I just want to point that out. And it aligns with the Colorado Broadband Roadmap strategy on incentivizing investment in areas of the state that haven't seen a lot of investment.
Thank you, Brandy. Wonderful. Well, we don't absolutely need to push it through the full 3 hours. I think everyone is entitled to 15 minutes of their life back. I hope that was helpful for everyone. There'll be a recording of the webinar published to the Advance-CPF site shortly, along with the slide deck. And I'll remind you, we're also going to produce a short video that goes into a little bit more detail than we did today on the workbook, and take advantage of all the reference material on the Advance-CPF website. And once it's open, the ZoomGrants online application portal, download the templates, start the application relatively soon. The online application portal, you start the application and you can revisit it as many times as you'd like. All your work automatically saves. So just start completing the application, start completing the documents to upload them when they're ready. And yeah, thank you so much for your attendance today. Look forward to your participation in the program.